together or reviewing the budget, you know, you'll have a comfort level of these are the answers. There's no arguing with this. These are the answers. This is where it's clearly set forth. This is the guidance that we need to provide. Steve wanted to jump in on the issue of conflict. Steve.
Yeah, just before we move on, if everybody goes back to, we're still on page 78-621, the discussion on conflict of interest. The one thing I want to point out, specifically the non-federal entity must disclose in writing any potential conflict of interest to the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity in accordance with applicable policy. So we've already said you have to have your own written conflict of interest policy, but what this is saying is that if you even have a potential conflict of interest, the non-federal entity, if it's at the state level, you need to report it to the federal awarding agency. If one of the school districts has a potential conflict of interest, they have to immediately report it in writing to you as the state, as the pass-through. The problem is they do not anywhere in this document say what a potential conflict of interest is. What they don't say where that, we talked about what constitutes a conflict of interest. But as far as where that threshold is for where it's a potential conflict versus an actual conflict, there's no specific line saying that if you're beyond this point, it's a potential conflict of interest. So when you're crafting your own policy or revising your own policy, you need to determine where that threshold is going to be, and you need to work with your school districts to do the exact same thing, just to make sure that you're all on the same page as to when it becomes a potential conflict of interest, just to make sure you're not violating this new policy, which will be included in the new language.
Thank you. All right, shifting gears now to financial management control. Financial management, it's the nucleus of this whole process, that under state administered programs, the dollars come to the Alaska Department of Ed. This agency is the pass-through. It serves as a fiduciary for all the monies that are awarded through this agency, either by formula or by competition. And that is, if Ketchikan, Sitka receive awards through the Alaska Department of Ed, federal funds, and Sitka goes ahead and misexpends those funds, the feds are coming after you. The feds are coming after Commissioner Hanley, they're coming after Paul. The deal is between the grantor and the state pass-through agency. So what comfort level do you have as you pass monies through competitively or by formula to the district charters and so forth, that they are running a system where they can protect the integrity of every dime that they receive, that they can track every single dollar, every asset purchased with federal funds. And it's through the financial management controls. It's the center of everything, financial management controls. It governs the performance metrics, risk management, pass-through responsibilities, corrective action, cooperative audit resolution. When Ketchikan can be reviewed by the federal auditors, the federal monitors, program monitors for various programs in this room, the special ed folks, for example, going down to a school district, or the single auditors. Whether it's OIG, single audit, federal program monitoring, state monitoring, you are required to look at the financial management controls that your district have in place. And your assessment of risk is going to be based on, do they have the controls in place that they can operate these programs? The more attention they pay to it now, the easier it's going to be for everyone. So on this slide, what I did, I've taken the 7 items that are currently in EDGAR, 80.20B, and I've taken the new 7 items that are in the UGG. And if you look, you can say, wow, Michael, they're virtually identical. And number 1 becomes number 2, number 3 becomes number 4, number 4 becomes number 5. What's the big deal? And I have to respond to you, big deal. There are some significant changes, but there are 7. So going forward, we're looking at 20 CFR 200.302B. These are the 7 elements that you are responsible for in terms of doing business with your local school districts and other sub-grantees. So let's quickly run through the 7. The first is identification. Going forward, every school district in the state will have to have controls in place that they can adequately and effectively identify every federal grant that they receive by the identification number of the grant, federal award ID, CFDA, Code of Federal Domestic Assistance. Every project has got a separate CFDA number. So the onus is on your districts to have in place an identification system. Second, financial reporting. And if you turn, the easiest way of doing this is looking at the text. 78624, right-hand column, where at 302B, 1 was identification, 2, right-hand column, accurate, current, and complete disclosure of the financial results of each federal award or program in accordance with the reporting requirements. And now there will be new forms that will be used for state administered programs as of July 1/15, direct programs, grants issued after this next week. New forms set out in 327, meeting the requirements of 328. This is all new under financial reporting. If you could turn to 328 for a minute, and that is on page 78634 to 78635. So 200.328, it's monitoring and reporting program performance. This gets into the whole new domain of performance metrics. This is what I said at the outset, is your new set of accountability requirements. They don't take place of the old ones. These are in addition to the old ones. And B1, third column, very bottom, the non-federal entity must submit performance reports at intervals no less than quarterly, no more than yearly. Performance reports. You've not been required to do it, your districts have not been required to do it, but now they will have to do it going forward. What's going to be in these performance reports, going over to the next page, number 2, left-hand column, the non-federal entity must submit performance reports using these OMB approved forms. What's going to be in them? A comparison of actual accomplishments to the objectives of the federal award established for the period. Essentially counting widgets. How many did you serve? What did you do with the money that were available? How does it stack up in terms of what you promised? This is the performance reporting. Did you not meet what you said you were going to do over the 12-month period? If not, why not? It says the reasons. Additional pertinent information, such as cost overruns or high unit costs. Going down to D, significant developments. Efforts may occur between the scheduled performance reporting dates that have significant impact upon the supported activity. The price of oil being reduced below $54 a barrel. Well, that is a significant factor in the state of Alaska in terms of raising revenues. That may have a very significant impact on performance. Maybe not this year, maybe next year. But obviously, that is a significant development which would need to be set out in these performance metrics. 1, problems, delays, or adverse conditions. I think $54 a barrel is an adverse condition that needs to be reported. 2, favorable developments. Oh, the price of oil doubled. It's now back to $106 a barrel. That would be reported in these metrics. So again, this is an area under financial reporting which we've never had before, brand new requirement, affirmative requirement. Question?
So when are they planning on coming out with those forms?
Great question. When is OMB coming out with those forms? Steve? When is OMB coming out with those forms?
So we put another bet on this. I mean, really, they have reporting forms already out there. What we're probably just going to see is a modified version of these forms.
He is our forms expert. You have a question on FATA, you have a question on any of the forms, this is the guy.
Oh, I have a FATA question.
Who's got a FATA question?
I do.
Ask him the FATA question.
What do you do, what is the requirement for reporting those entities that don't have the zip code that creates an error? If you're submitting your data through the CMP.
And you put the zip code in and you get an error message?
Yes.
There is no way to fix that. They have to fix that on their own. What you need to do, if you can get a screen capture of the error message,
Yeah.
that way anytime an auditor brings it up, because it's built in, especially in the most recent compliance supplement, it says that if the grantee is making a good faith effort to attempt to hit all the reporting deadlines,
Right.
the auditor has to take that into consideration. So if you could take a screen capture showing like date and time, we
Yeah, I can do
attempted to
that.
put this in, that's really all you can do. If the auditor is still hitting you with a finding on that, then they're ignoring the guidance and compliance. But there's nothing you can do.
Actually, you can hand enter it.
You can hand it?
Yeah, you can. But am I required to?
Well, okay, yeah. That's part of that good thing. If you can put in the information, if you can and you don't, then you're not meeting the good faith effort requirement.
I was afraid you were going to say that. Is there any?
That worries me, because I've gotten that question before. Nobody else has ever told me they can do it by
Yeah, you
hand.
can. It takes forever. So it makes it means that you go from maybe a couple hours a month to 2 days a month in order to get it all entered and to make sure you've got it, to check it, to make sure it's correct.
The only thing I can tell you is if you can put in the information, you have to do that to meet the good faith effort requirement. What you should then do is, I assume the website at this point has to know that that's a problem and that they should be looking into it. But it also would not hurt for you to send them another notice that, if you guys want us to keep doing this on time, you've got to give us some help here.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
It's
Steve.
not good news.
You know what, I get that pretty much everywhere I go.
All right, so on financial management, 1, identification, 2, the financial reporting performance metrics, 3, your records. Records that identify adequately the source and application of funds, including these activities, the awards, authorizations, obligations, unobligated balances, assets, expenditures, income, interest. That's pretty much a carry forward. The key is source documentation. If your district lacks source documentation, you gotta pay the money back. When there's an agreement to accept funds, there's a burden of proof that shifts to the district to saying they're accepting these federal funds. They've got to be able to maintain source documentation of what they did with them. 4, very important on internal control. Internal controls here. If you would look at number 4 in the book. Again, we're back at page 78625. This language in number 4 is cited over and over again by the federal monitors and the federal auditors and often single auditors. Effective control over and accountability for all funds. And if you could just underscore the word all funds, property and other assets. The non-federal entity must adequately safeguard all assets and ensure that they are used solely for authorized purposes. So this is the catch-all that the auditors use. The entity receives the money and they say, well, we purchased iPods, we purchased digital cameras, these items were $50, $60. We didn't maintain any records for them. And there's no requirement for us to inventory, they'll say. Well, the auditors automatically will cite you on this one here, where it says you must have controls in place for all assets, all funds. There's no excuse to saying, oh, a digital camera only costs $50. We don't need to worry about that. Any technological items that have the tendency to walk, the feds have an interest in. And it's covered by this particular item in number 4. Number 5, budget control. A comparison of expenditures with budget amounts for each federal award, essentially a carryover of the old rule, but this is your responsibility. You approve each year a budget for a 12-month period for your school districts. There is an affirmative responsibility to make sure that the expenditures during that 12-month period, those expenditures are aligned with the approved budget, aligned with the budget. If there's a deviation, they need your authority to deviate. They're moving monies from travel to personnel or personnel to equipment. They can't do that at random. They need your authority to go ahead and make those distortions. 6 and 7 are significantly changed. For the first time ever, it says under 6, written procedure to implement the requirements of 305 dealing with payment. These are your written policies on cash management. Now, why is this a new requirement? Because there's massive confusion in the field of federal grants management on the difference between advance funding and reimbursement. Yes, Alaska Department of Ed uses a system of reimbursement. The problem is, not everyone understands exactly what reimbursement is. There have been a number of federal audits lately where the Inspector General has gone to the state, and the state draws from G5 to allocate to districts after the districts provide evidence to the state through monthly expenditure reports or other forms that the district has in fact obligated the funds, that they've entered into a contract with the vendor, or they've entered into a contract to travel, and they've got the plane ticket that they have to pay for, even though the travel and payment has not taken place yet. And the auditors have asked for millions of dollars back, not because the state or district was sitting on interest, but the auditors imputed the interest there. Pat is the assistant superintendent for the state of California. I will never forget, it was a few years ago, Pat and I are having dinner together in Sacramento, and Pat says to me, did you know that yesterday the superintendent of schools received from LA Unified a check for $23 million? I said, no, Pat. You remember that? He said, yeah, we just received a check for $23 million from Los Angeles Unified. And immediately my head goes into a spin. I'm saying, $23 million in interest? Do the math. How much money do you have to sit on to generate $23 million in interest? Well, let me say, California is not the national leader. This is not any offense to Pat, but California is not the national leader when it comes to cash management. Because what the state of California had done, not only through education, but through many of the state agencies, is that when they got federal grants, they got them on July 1, they dispersed the amounts to the county treasurers. The county treasurers sat on those amounts and then dispersed them as needed. And at the end of the 12-month period, they would send back whatever interest that they had calculated. In LA, obviously, one of the largest school districts in the United States, is having a lot of money. Well, the feds were not particularly happy. When a $23 million check goes through the banking system, sends off certain bells and whistles, and the Inspector General, the Chief Financial Officer, and they all found out about it, and basically they were on the plane out. In fact, when the ARA monies first became available in 2009 under the stimulus program, the administration said, spend the monies quickly but wisely. They arrived in California. Notice all these billions are available to California. California immediately dispersed them out. So when the CFO came into Washington on Monday morning and realized that billions were missing, they said, oh my God, California has dispersed it to these county treasuries all over the state. So they said, we've got to do something about this. People don't understand really the distinction between advance and reimbursement. Reimbursement is when the district actually pays out of its own pocket for salaries or travel or contracts with vendors. They're buying equipment. They're changing things around. They pay for it out of their own pocket. And then they say to the state, we have dispersed this, now reimburse us. That's the way the feds look at reimbursement. So they're saying, We want not only the state to reduce this to writing, the state is subject to what's called the CMIA, the Cash Management Improvement Act, but all of your school districts must have going forward, and this is something you need to relate to them. There's an affirmative requirement that every school district in Alaska, University of Alaska, your charters, all your nonprofits, have written procedures on cash management. There are some minor variances, changes here in the past. Post-secondary institutions could hold on to $250 in interest a year, keeping themselves, school districts, $100. That's all been changed now. Everyone is subject to $500, not by program, by organization. So the first $500 that Anchorage might accumulate in interest belongs to Anchorage. Anything over that goes back to the state. The state remits that annually, not to Ed, but to the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's an annual remission of interest through the pass-through when any one organization generates $500 or more in interest. Those are significant changes on your written procedures on cash management. I'm going to just jump now to allowability. Number 7 there on financial management. It says under number 7, written procedures for determining the allowability of costs. This is what Paul referred to in terms of reviewing budget. Never before had we had this requirement. Now every school district, as well as the state, must have written procedures. So let's just say tomorrow, as this guidance comes out, you send it will be on the internet tomorrow, and you forward this to all your school districts. And you say, oh, by the way, for any monies that you receive after December 26th, next week, you have to have these written procedures on allowability. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen? They're just going to open back up to that table of contents, subpart E, which is the part on allowability, and they'll just photocopy or type it out and say, okay, these are our written procedures on cash management. That is not what the federal government wants. Every organization, every unit, school district in the state is a little bit different, and they go through the budgeting process a little bit different. This is a description of how they put their budgets together to determine what's going to be allowable with federal grants, what's not allowable, what's going to require special conditions, special permission, and so forth. And we'll be talking to you a bit more about allowability. But this is new, written procedures. They don't have it, they have to have it. They have to have it in place. And you need to get the information out to let them know. Okay, period of performance. I say period of performance basically is unchanged in the circular. But the question was asked at the outset, well, what if, for example, under the school nutrition programs, there are more restrictive rules? Always remember, if there's more restrictive rules, you've got to follow the more restrictive rules. Education does have more restrictive rules, different rules under period of performance. And it's set out in that section 76 dealing with state administered programs. And basically what 76.708 says, for state administered programs where the monies are awarded on a formula, that would be most of the ESEA programs, but not 21st century. 21st century funds in Alaska do not go out by formula, they go out competitively. But for the Title I, for the ESEA programs, the IDEA programs, the Perkins programs, where the monies go out by formula, it says the period of performance is the date that the district submits to the state its annual plan in substantially approvable form. That is not a directive from OMB, that's a peculiar rule for education, and that will stay in place. So your period of performance cannot start prior to the funds becoming available, which would be July 1, but if, say, Fairbanks submits its program plan on June 28th, submits it on June 28th, and Kurt, say for Career Tech, and Kurt reviews it with his staff And on July 15th, Kurt sends an email back to Fairbanks and saying, what you submitted is substandard, it doesn't meet the requirements of the Perkins Act. It's not substantially approvable. It goes back to Fairbanks. Now Fairbanks on August 1 resubmits its plan to Kurt. And on August 15, Kurt notifies Fairbanks, well, what you submitted on August 1 is substantially approvable. It's not approvable, but it's substantially approvable. You still need to do X, Y, and Z, which is done by September 1. The period of performance starts on August 1, on the date they had submitted the plan to the state in substantially approvable form. That governs ESEA, not 21st century, and IDEA as well. That means for programs that have matching maintenance and so forth, you cannot count towards matching or MOE anything that's spent at the local level during a blackout period. That period in my hypothetical for Fairbanks from July 1 to August 1, when they did not have a substantially approvable plan in place, that's a blackout period. You can't count towards matching and maintenance of effort. Programs such as Adult Ed, which is the Department of Labor, for 21st Century, which is in this agency, where the monies go out competitively, under any program where the monies go out competitively, the period of performance under EDGAR is from the date, not that it's submitted in substantially approvable form, but on the date it's deemed approved. So if you don't think the plan is approved until August 15th, you've got a blackout period. You cannot reimburse for obligations incurred during that blackout period. Any questions on that? A distinction, yes?
So you're going to have potentially a different period of performance for each district, for each program that's awarded by formula?
Not will. This has been the law. This has been the law for 30 years. It's always been based on the submission of substantially approvable plan, and that you cannot allow obligation against federal grants until they have submitted a plan in substantially approvable form.
So that, is this different than the period of availability?
Yes, very different. Period of availability is that funds, the Chromebooks that I talked about, which was just signed the last 48 hours by the president, provides funding for the state-administered programs for Alaska for the period beginning July 1/15. The period of availability under the Chromebook starts July 1/15. That's when the funds will first become available. Under the state-administered programs, ESEA, IDEA, Perkins, to the state, those funds are available for 27 months, to September 30, 2017. That is the period of availability. What's called the Tidings Amendment, the carryover provision says funds that are not appropriated, that are not obligated by the state or the locals within the first 12 months of availability are carried over for an additional year. But since the federal fiscal year had shifted from, it used to be July 1 to June 30, it's now October 1 to September 30, it's a 27-month period. So the period of availability is 27 months. The period of performance is the date in which the plan is submitted and substantially approved. So there's a significant difference. Other questions? Paul?
Well, I just wanted to clarify, back when this, we asked Sandy Brown for guidance. He was on what is a definition of substantially approvable. So we as an agency in the past, that's why we encourage districts to get all their applications in by June 30th. And we've been, I think, pretty good at informing districts that they can't have funds. If we don't have an application by June 30th, we can't issue a grant starting July 1. But really, substantially approvable that we've defined it is if we have a clear budget narrative, even though the application might have some holes, if the budget narratives, that's been our threshold for substantially approvable. It's been a pretty low bar.
You did. You said a low bar. I have no problems with that. I have no problems with that at all. Okay, insurance coverage, new requirement, never had it before. It simply says that if your school district have a protocol where they insure assets that are purchased with non-federal dollars, then they must have comparable insurance coverage for assets purchased with federal dollars. Again, never before, new requirement.
Michael, just to let everybody know, that citation should be 200.310.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Can I step back one slide?
Any
You
question?
said that you talked about the blackout period, and I thought I heard you saying that during, let's say if it was from July 1st to August 1st, that during that time they couldn't count sort of anything that was seen as sort of an in-kind contribution. But then I thought I
And
heard you
also, they
later
can't be
say-
reimbursed. You cannot be reimbursed with federal funds during a blackout period.
Okay. So they
That's-
should not be incurring any costs during that time because they won't be able to.
They
you
will,
won't be able to
but you
backdate until
cannot,
July 1st.
you cannot use federal funds to pay for it. They would have to use non-federal funds to pay for it. And it cannot be calculated towards the match or MOE.
But I mean, we couldn't backdate their award to July 1st.
No, we don't, Steve and I don't want to hear that term back.
Okay. Which we never ever do.
Right, okay.
Which we
All
never
right.
do. We have the substantially approvable form for all reimbursements.
Okay, on equipment, there are some changes that you all need to be aware of. So if you return to page 78629. I want to, at the very bottom there, but really going over to the next page, you need to be aware of what I consider to be changes in substantive policy when your districts use federal funds to purchase equipment. The first item here, it says, when a district uses federal funds to purchase equipment, say under ESEA or special ed or Perkins, and there comes a time when this district says it's no longer needed. We purchased it with federal funds, but it's no longer needed for that program. Obviously, you can get rid of it, but you don't have to get rid of it. It says, when no longer needed for the original program or project, the equipment may be used in other activities supported by, and now it's a list of priorities. And you need to have these protocols. First, if the program was funded by the U.S. Education Department, you look to other activities in the school or district that are funded by the U.S. Education Department. There are none that need it, then other activities that are funded by the Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, the National Science Foundation. You clearly have that justification. Then it goes on to say in number 2, left-hand column, big number 2, this is shared use, and this is important. During the time that the equipment is used on the project or program for which it was acquired, the non-federal entity must, mandatory, also make the equipment available for use on other projects or programs currently or previously supported by the federal government, provided that such use will not interfere with the work on the project for which it was originally acquired. So if you've got an 8-period day, and you bought a computer lab with Perkins funds, and it's only being used for the career tech students for 5 of those 8, and it's sitting idle for 3 of those 8, it says that use it. In other words, if you're spending federal funds to set up a computer lab, put it in use as much as possible. Use it during those other 3 periods. You can't use it if the use is going to interfere with the use of the CTE students. Now, this provides somewhat of a tension as you read through all the provisions of the 100 pages. Let's just say, you purchased that computer lab with Perkins funds, 8-period day, and you're using it for 4 periods, and the other 4 periods you're using it for your special ed students. Doesn't it make sense under the rules of allocability that special ed pay for the other 50%? I think the answer to that question is yes. I wish it stated that under shared use. But if you go back to that provision on financial management where it says the assets must be used for the intended purposes, if you go to the rules under allocability, which we're going to go to momentarily, I think that special ed, if you know that special ed's going to use it half-time, if Title I is going to use it a quarter time, there should be support towards that computer lab. Where you don't know it ahead of time, you can't ask for that money. But if you do, in terms of budgeting, and you're going to set up this computer lab, the other programs should pay their proportionate share of that cost. Will this always work in a perfect mathematical formula? No, it doesn't. But I wanted to share with you what the rules are on sharing. So it sets up 3 preferences. It says, first preference for other use is given to activities supported by the U.S. Education Department. Then it says, second preference is given to activities supported by other federal agencies. Then third preference to any other activity. And that's new. First, second, third. First, the agency where you got it from. Second, other federal agency activities. Third, any other activity. Doesn't even have to be supported by the federal government. Number 3, this is new. It says, notwithstanding provisions on program income, the non-federal entity must not use equipment acquired with the federal award to provide services for a fee that is less than private companies charge. Kurt, this really applies really to career tech, where you have horticulture, where you have cosmetology, where you have automotive set up in tech schools, and they're competing with the private sector. A beauty parlor down the street. It says you can't pay for that cosmetology program with federal funds and then have them charge $5 for a haircut where the hair salon is charging $20 for the haircut. So you want to set it up in a way that that does not happen by saying, hey, the haircuts we give are not professional haircuts. They're given by students. Make that distinction. Otherwise, you're going to run afoul of this new provision. Number 4 here, brand new on replacement. We've never had this flexibility before. For the last 40 years, when a district used federal funds to buy equipment and then wanted to upgrade, if the fair market value of that equipment at the time you're getting rid of it exceeded $5,000, for example, you run aviation programs out of Anchorage, your aviation equipment may exceed $5,000 and you're getting rid of it, you had to return that to the federal government, no longer. This now supersedes it. It says when acquiring replacement equipment, the non-federal entity may use the equipment to be replaced as a trade-in or sell the property and use the proceeds to offset the cost of the replacement property. So now, carte blanche, you don't have to return the money to the federal government. You can simply trade up, take whatever the proceeds are, whether you sell it on eBay, Craigslist, or whatever, and use that towards the new equipment. So that is all new. The rules on Steve, go
Well,
ahead.
just, I mean, he's gonna get to this in disposition, but when you make that switch to the replacement equipment, the feds still keep their federal share. So if, you use 50% federal funds to pay for it, and then you get the replacement equipment, the feds still have that 50% share in that replaced equipment. So that way, when you then dispose of it, you have to, revert back to them accordingly.
But if you continue the programs in perpetuity,
Well, yeah.
okay.
You're
Pat.
about to talk about this.
So, if you're running a wood shop and you decide you need a new table saw, and you go to sell the table saw, the teacher can't buy it. Would that be a conflict of interest?
Great question. The teacher can't buy it. You have rules on disposition. I mean, for example, some districts will say, our rules on surplus apply. Some districts, I've been all over the country, some districts say, we put it on the curb. In New York, we just put it on the curb, somebody comes and picks it up. They allow it to be purchased on eBay or Craigslist. Seriously, whatever the rules are on disposition, it's allowing employees to buy it. Once a decision's made, the problem is if the teacher says, I want to get a new wood saw, and then the teacher immediately buys that. That can be problematic. You've got to follow your disposition rules. All right, on the bottom of the first column, D, management requirements. Pretty much exactly the way they have it, but they're so important because the auditors and you as monitors must know what are the management rules for these assets. The first one, property records. It means anything purchased with federal funds, computers, whatever, you want to have these controls in place. Property records must be maintained that include a description of the property, a serial number or ID number, the source of the funding, who holds title, the acquisition date, the cost of the property, percentage of federal participation, location, use and any ultimate disposition. So what happens? The feds come in, you go in, you ask for an Excel spreadsheet, show us everything you purchased with federal grant funds under this program for the last 24 months. They say, oh, we purchased 30 laptops. That Excel spreadsheet is going to say, well, where are the laptops? And then you go to the school buildings and you check and you say, well, you said you purchased 30, we can only identify by serial number 20. Oh, the other 10 the teachers took home. Acceptable? Well, yeah, but you need controls in place so that when the reviewers come in and 10 are missing, you have controls in place to know where those 10 are. We've seen too many audits come down the pike where the monitors and the auditors go in, they say they purchased this, they go looking for it, and they're not where you said they have been. And that causes exposure. 2, a physical inventory once every 2 years. 3, a control system to ensure adequate safeguards to prevent loss, damage, or theft. Any loss, damage, or theft must be investigated. It does not say if there's theft, you've got to replace it. That's not the federal standard. It says if there's theft, you've got to investigate it. So when the auditors and monitors come in, well, we purchased 20 computers, we only have 16 left. What happened to the other 4? They were stolen. They're not going to say, well, you've got to replace those 4. They're going to say, well, show us your investigation report that you've investigated the theft. Police report, insurance report, and so forth. That's what's required by federal law. 4, adequate maintenance procedures maintained, and then records on disposition.
Michael, question.
Yeah, go ahead.
In my prior life,
Yeah.
do police reports, if you report to police, they submit the reports, does that count as documentation?
Yes.
If that's what you turn it over,
Yes.
because I had an issue with the prior district, that I had an auditor that said no.
That's what's required.
Okay.
Steve, you agree? I mean, police report, that shows an investigation took place. Obviously, to try to improve your safety of these assets, they were stolen. What can we do to prevent this from happening in the future? That's what this is all about, improving those controls. Now, going over to supplies in 200.314. So if you look here, it says materials and supplies, including the cost of computing devices. So printers, copiers, computers are now supplies, as long as their per unit value is $5,000 or less. And you'd be hard pressed to pay more than $5,000 for an individual computer, laptop, PC, whatever. What's changed is the disposition when you decide we no longer need these supplies. The disposition of equipment, which means at disposition, the fair market value, if it's under $5,000, there's no further recourse to the federal government. Per unit under $5,000, no further recourse to the federal government. For supplies, you look at the aggregate value of all unused supplies. If it's greater than $5,000, then you send a check back to the federal government. So again, equipment is per unit, under 5,000, no recourse. Per unit over 5,000, yes. Supplies, which now covers computers, it's the aggregate value of unused supplies. Greater than 5,000, so the aggregate value you send back. No, you're saying, well, what's the real distinction here? The distinction, believe it or not, happens a lot. It's where districts get an award letter, a grant award letter from the state. It says for the 12-month period, this is the funding you have available for special ed, get Title I. They're trying to obligate these dollars during the 12-month period. There's 2 weeks left, or 4 weeks left of the school year. They realize they have additional monies that they haven't obligated. So they go out and they purchase some computers, printers or copiers. School year's ended, but the performance period is not ended. You order the computers within the period of performance. The computers come in their boxes, they're pretty boxes, and the teachers, whoever ordered it, they're not there. They're put into a warehouse. School year begins next August or September, and they forget that there are these new printers, copiers, computers sitting in that warehouse to start the program. Several months later, they say, oh, these things are in the warehouse, oh, we don't need them, or we got something else to take their place. That is now on inventory, it's unused. And that clearly in the aggregate is going to exceed $5,000, where it would have to be paid back to the federal government. We deal with this more often than you would otherwise think. So our advice to you, whenever you purchase anything in a box, take it out of the box. That's your advice, just take it out of the box. If it stays in the box, the prima facie evidence it's unused. Comes out of the box, pretty good evidence it's being used. You know, another thing here on purchasing computers. In some of the states I go, particularly Kurt, with regard to career tech, these local directors come up to me and they say, we buy new computers for career tech every single year. I go, well, why? Because we can. Because we know we're always going to get the same award. We're going to get new computers. But after the first 12 months, we give it to the reading program, we give it to the math program. They're really happy that we're giving them the computers, and we can get new ones. Well, that violates the rule unnecessary. It's just not necessary to do that. This isn't about sharing with the math program and the reading program. But these problems often arise. We just wanted to share with you some of the changes. Okay, procurement. We talked about this really at the beginning. So now there are this. You say, boy, that's a really silly diagram here. This isn't ours. This COFAR, the Council on Federal Systems Reform, drafted this bear claw, perfect for Alaska. And it says, this is the way we should look at procurement going forward. Again, for the states, you're going to follow state rules. Everybody else follows 200.320. Any items up to $3,000, called a micro purchase. So if we can just turn to micro purchases for a minute and turn over to page 78632. 78632. So right-hand column, 200.320. Procurement by micro purchase. Procurement by micro purchase is the acquisition of supplies, services. You want to bring in an evaluator. He says, we'll charge $3,200. You say, well, we'll have to go through competitive bidding. You say, if you reduce it to $3,000, we don't have to do any competitive bidding. We don't have to do any cost price analysis, really. They'll reduce their price to $3,000. So it's an amount that does not exceed $3,000. To the extent practical, a non-federal entity must distribute micro purchases equitably, that's important, equitably, among qualified suppliers. That means you've got $9,000 left to the end of the performance period. Don't take $3,000 invoices over to Staples or Computer Depot. Take it to 3 different places. It says equitably. Micro purchases may be awarded without soliciting competitive quotations if the non-federal entity considers the price to be reasonable. Minimum due diligence there. Go on Amazon.com. It matches an Amazon.com price. You've done your due diligence on that. That's real easy. Could the state say to school districts, everyone's got to follow state law, we're not going to give you the flexibility on contracts under $3,000? The state could do that and impose its own rule. But if the state does not, the districts now have to take advantage of this flexibility. The next one, small purchases from $3,000 to $150,000. And that is the next paragraph there, where it says procurement by small purchase procedures are those relatively simple and informal methods for securing services. If small purchase procedures are used, price or rate quotations must be obtained from an adequate number of qualified sources. COFAR says that means 2. It doesn't mean 3, it means 2. You satisfy that requirement for small purchases. Sealed bids is really not going to be used in the education enterprise. Competitive proposals more often, greater than $150,000. That's where you put out specific elements that they're going to bid upon, and you might give it to the best, lowest price that has the capability of carrying it out. the red flag one is number 5, sole source. Again, you've got to prove, you've got to be able to validate that the entity under a sole source arrangement is the only entity that's able to carry out that particular activity. Okay, grant versus contract, it's real important under 200.330. If you could turn to that. Question?
Can you go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
On the sole source, how does that fit with the Alaska preference or Alaska Native entity preference?
I'm not familiar with the Alaska, but if you look under bidding, it says very specifically that you cannot give preference for a geographic area, saying, you know, we're going to give more points if the provider is within a 100-mile radius or in this particular state. Steve, you want to comment on that?
I mean, there's the thing about Alaska being as geographically separated as it is, the thing that's going to come up is that if you are specifically only contracting with in-state organizations, the reasoning you would use is that because you don't have to go through as much transportation costs as somebody from one of the lower 48, it's a lower price, a more reasonable contract, that's what you do. As far as this, I'm not familiar with the preference you're referencing.
Sole source in this state is really, it's a rare occasion. For example, Child Nutrition had a software designer who created very unique software just for child nutrition. So we have an internal part of our internal process. We would go through OMB and say we're doing a sole source procurement because of X, Y, and Z, and we justify it. It's really rare, but we have state processes that already cover the sole source.
Question?
This is covering our grantees, not, because we follow our state regulations for procurement.
That's right. So the state is subject to the state rules. It's the other grantees that would be subject to these.
These are school districts that are
Right.
subject to these rules. And does the authorized by agency under sole source mean that we as a department have to approve any sole source by a school district?
No. It means that the due diligence can be done from the state agency, where the state agency says to the school districts, if you purchase software or hardware from these vendors, we have done the due diligence to make sure that these prices are competitive. That's what it's referring to. Question?
The last time I asked a question about USDA, it was an instance where they were more stringent. Now, this is the opposite question. They do allow a GeoPref on food purchasing. So, but you're saying that through this legislation?
Always use the more restrictive rule here. Now, it's interesting because we represent Puerto Rico. We've represented Puerto Rico for a long time. Under the USDA programs, they put in a significant preference for purchasing of food items from Puerto Rico. The Department of Agriculture came in and lowered the boom on them on having that preference in and said, we're simply not going to tolerate you having that preference because that violates the uniform rules. So I know in Puerto Rico, at least they follow the uniform rules of the Department of Agriculture. If you have specific written guidance saying you can have preferences for where the food is purchased because it's Alaska, I think that's fine. Puerto Rico did not have that authority.
It's done ahead of time, so a district
Right.
should be able to say, we're going to allow a 5% GeoPref. But they still have to go out competitive. They can't only solicit for local foods. But if they had a local vendor apply,
Right.
they can apply that 5%. And that's
You know,
by
and in
policy.
fact, if I remember correctly, when we handled the Puerto Rico matter with the Department of Ag, we, as our defense, we pointed to what Alaska had. Because Puerto Rico did not have a comparable benefit. We pointed, so now that I remember, you guys they did allow a preference for Alaska, and they did not allow a preference for Puerto Rico, which I think is pretty unfair. But anyway, so
Don't ask that
Senator
question again.
Stevens.
Proceed until apprehended, Joe.
Yeah. Okay, grant and this is so important. The monies come to you, the Alaska Department of Ed, as a grant. You in turn disperse those monies to your districts through a grant. Once the districts receive those monies, they carry out the services themselves or they contract out. They cannot further subgrant. Once the state gives a grant under ESEA, IDA, or Perkins, your districts cannot further subgrant unless Congress specially authorizes that. Only Congress has the authority to designate grantees, because a grantee is much different than a contract vendor. What is the distinction? That is set out here in this regulation. And on the right-hand column, it sets out the 5 characteristics of what is a grant, and then it sets out the 5 characteristics of what is a contract. Keep in mind, it says under what is a grant, that grantees are subject to all the federal compliance requirements. Under vendors, it says that vendors are not subject to any of the federal compliance requirements. Vendors are only subject to the terms of the contract. So it's a very important distinction. The money's going to your school districts, they receive it as a grant. If they want to enter into contracts, they certainly have that authority. But they've got to define in the contracts what they expect. The school district remains 100% responsible for 100% of those funds. Do vendors have to have time and effort records that are required by federal law? Absolutely not. It's only what's written in that particular contract. Okay, this is the bad news under pass-through responsibility. So if you would turn to this section dealing with pass-through responsibility, and this is set out here on page 78636. Anybody in the room that was thinking about retirement, after you get through reading page 78636, this may confirm that you want to retire sooner rather than later. So this page sets out a lot of new affirmative responsibilities for the pass-through that you've not had before. So if you don't want to look at any of the 100 pages, at least look at this page. So starting at the top, on the left-hand column, it sets out your responsibilities, and it shows what you've got to do with regard to every sub-award. And in that left-hand column, it identifies 13 items that you've got to communicate to your school districts. And then in addition to that, it says number 2, you've got to inform them of all requirements that are imposed by the federal law. And then 3, if the state of Alaska wants to impose its own priorities, it can do that, but it's got to communicate that to your school districts. That's in number 3. And then in number 4, it says you're responsible for state administered programs for negotiating indirect cost rates. And then if you go down to number 6, not number 6, paragraph B in the middle, this is where you find the information and the new requirements on risk assessment. It says, you, the pass-through, shall evaluate each sub-recipient, that's organization, each school district's risk of non-compliance with federal statutes, regs, and the terms and conditions of the sub-award, which may include consideration of such factors as 1, the sub-recipient's prior experience in handling that program. 2, the results of previous audits or monitoring visits. 3, whether the school district has new personnel, a new CFO. And Paul informs me there's a lot of turnover in the school districts here. So this is probably being checked every single year. You're getting new personnel, new CFOs, new project directors, or a substantially changed system. And 4, the extended results of other monitoring visits. And these are set out as a suggested list. So basically, you're coming up with a risk assessment. Paul asked during the break, are there suggested risk assessment systems out there? There are many. We'll share them with Paul. There are a few national models in place that we will share with you. But you're going to assign points. So new CFO in the district, we're going to give you 5 points. Same CFO for 20 years, 0 points. Prior monitoring problems, 5 points. No monitoring prior problems, 0 points. And then you just count up all the points, and you see who's got the highest score. They're gonna get your attention. And then it takes you down now to paragraph C. Consider imposing specific conditions on the school district if they score high on your risk assessment in accord with 207. And that is requiring additional reporting, requiring a management team to come in and help. A variety of different conditions can be imposed by the state on your school district if you are concerned. Now, please pay particular attention to this requirement with regard to non-traditional providers. Non-traditional providers are in programs such as 21st Century, where it says nonprofits can be the recipients, that faith-based can be, if they do not have the institutional capacity for audits, handling federal funds, in doing your risk assessment, you may want to impose on them additional reporting requirements, or requiring them to have a school district as a fiscal agent to protect you, the state. Because if the nonprofit walks off with the funds, the state's going to be left holding the bag. So that's why this is important. And then D, here, monitor. This is important. The state pass-through, you, will monitor the activities as a subrecipient as necessary to ensure that the award is used for authorized purposes in compliance with all the requirements. And that the pass-through monitoring must mandatory include, 1, you've got to review the financial and programmatic reports that are submitted to you by your school districts. 2, you've got to then follow up and ensure that each district takes timely and appropriate action on all deficiencies. 3, issuing management decision letters. And then E, depending upon your assessment of the risk posed by your school district, this is very important. The following tools may be useful for you to ensure proper accountability and compliance. Now, notice that you say may. The following tools may be used. 1, providing your districts with training and technical assistance on program-related matters. And then it says, and 2, performing on-site reviews of their operations. Notice this is may, suggested tool. There's nowhere in the 100 pages where it says the Alaska Department of Ed shall do on-site monitoring. That is not required. It says you might want to consider that. I personally believe you cannot do proper inventory monitoring on a desk level review in Juneau of what's going on in Fairbanks. The only way that you can determine compliance with inventory rules is doing it on site. You may disagree with me. This certainly does not require on site. It just says it's a suggested tool. You must monitor, you must reflect your risk assessment, and then you're going to decide, do we want to provide training? Do we want to provide technical assistance? Do we actually want to go on site? So this has changed significantly from current law under 80.40 for monitoring by the pass-through. Okay, I'm going to jump from here over to the last part, which is going to be the cost principles under what was 87, the cost principles. Now here, this is set out on page 78639. Remember, every district in the state has got to have their navigation rules on costs put into writing. When do they need it? Well, it'd be great if they had it by next week, which is December 26th, for direct grant, but for state administered, they clearly need it no later than July 1. If they're getting direct assistance, they really need it in place prior to getting that direct assistance. They really should not be in the dark that the whole landscape here is changing. But if you look over on page 78640, you'll see on the left-hand side basic consideration. And really, one of the most important parts of these 100 pages is on the left-hand side, 200.403, factors affecting allowability of costs. And it says, A, necessary, reasonable, allocable. Those are the three most important terms. If you are writing a budget or you are reviewing a budget, always remember, necessary, reasonable, allocable. And one effective way of applying those rules is by setting up gates. You're reviewing a budget, or you're putting a budget together, and the local superintendent goes to the budget writer and says, that couch in my office is threadbare. I want to use the Title I funds to get a new couch. Now, how does that budget writer respond? That budget writer will say, well, sir or madam, if you open up to the Uniform Grant Guidance on page 78640 and you look at the basic rules, it says that any item that we purchase with federal grant funds must be necessary. And we would be hard pressed to show that that new couch in your office is necessary for the Title I program. And it should stop right there, because it's not necessary. But now you've got the special ed director coming to you and saying, we need new computers for our computer lab. And they are necessary because the old ones are all broken. Okay, they're necessary. But the special ed director says, but we would like iMacs in that computer lab. We want 20 iMacs at a cost of $2,800 each. And then you've got to go back to this page and you say, well, would that cost be reasonable? And then you look in the middle paragraph and it defines reasonable. A cost is reasonable if its nature and amount it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time that the decision was made. And if a Dell computer or a Hewlett-Packard computer for $600 can do the same work that's needed for that lab, then that budget writer is going to say, well, we can't afford $2,400. That's not reasonable. So the inquiry stops at that second gate on reasonable. But now you've got your career tech person, Dean, coming to the budget writer and saying, well, we need computers for our CTE students who will be in the computer lab for half a day. And says that to the budget director. And the CTE person says, we can afford this under our grant award from the state. Well, then you look to the issue of allocability. Is it allocable? And that's defined in 405 at the bottom of the middle column. It says a cost is allocable to a particular award or other cost objective if the goods or services involved are chargeable or assignable in accordance with the benefits received. It's proportionality. If it's only going to be used 50% of the time for CTE and 50% for something else, then CTE should only pay 50% of the cost. So either in developing the budget or reviewing the budget, you would always follow these three rules. Is the item necessary? Is the cost reasonable? And what is the benefit to that particular program? That's called allocability. Allocability is a sub-element of allowability. Allocability is not synonymous with allowability. It's only a subset of that. Once you get through that analysis, then you're going to say, well, is this item, these computers, is this really allowable under the program? And you go and you start with the statute. And you open up the statute, just as a perfect statute, and you find it has very little information on what's allowable or not allowable. And that's the case virtually with every federal education statute, most statutes. To get the real information that you need as to whether or not something's allowable, you turn back to your table of contents here on page 78609. If you go to page 78609, under subpart E, cost principles, and you go 3/4 of the way down, it says general provisions for selected items of cost, consideration for selected items of cost, and then beginning at 200.421, you have 55 elements listed in alphabetical order. 55. Under some of these 55, again, in alphabetical order, it's going to say it's allowable. So for advertising, it's going to say generally unallowable. You can't use federal grant funds to advertise the organization. You can't use federal grant funds to promote the features of the federal program. It says you can't use federal funds to purchase gifts or awards for students, but you can, again, use it to get newsprint to say you're running a new federal activity. You're not going to find that in the federal statute. You're not going to find that in the federal program regulations. You're only going to find that in the cost principles. And again, this is the rewrite of OMB Circular 887. And then you go down to alcoholic beverages, and you're going to say, under no circumstances can you use funds for alcoholic beverages. And then you're going to go down to, well, we're going to skip for a moment over personnel compensation, and we're going to go down to conferences. Now, this is really interesting here. Everyone needs to be aware of what's going on in the world of conferences. So if you would turn to the provision here on conferences, and that would be on page 78650. 78650. He said, at first it defines a conference. And it says a conference is defined as a meeting, retreat, seminar, symposium, workshop, where the primary purpose is the dissemination of technical information. So what we're doing today clearly meets the definition. This is a workshop where we're disseminating technical information on federal programs. Now, let's say that based on what happens today, you decide you're going to run a statewide, the Alaska Department of Ed is going to hold a conference in Anchorage for personnel in all the school districts in the state to come to Anchorage at a meeting conducted that is sponsored or hosted by the Alaska Department of Ed to disseminate this information. What costs can be charged to the various federal grants from the folks that are going to attend that conference who are sitting in this room or the folks in these school districts? So read on, and it says, allowable conference costs paid by the school district or the state as a sponsor. Please note, as a sponsor or host. If you come to Las Vegas, New Orleans, Washington to my conference, I'm the host. I am not a non-federal entity. This is important. This is important. It's when you are the host, where you are running the conference, or the school district is running the conference, or the University of Alaska is running the conference. They are the host. It says, allowable costs include the cost of meals and transportation unless further restricted by the terms and conditions of the federal award. Of the 35 federal agencies that award federal assistance, one of them, i.e. the U.S. Education Department, and the grant awards that went out to Alaska and the 49 other states, you have it here? Okay, I'm going to defer to you in a second. Attached on July 1, 2014, a special appendix which said grant funds should not, if you are hosting a conference, grant funds should not be used to pay for food, for meals, unless it meets a very, very high bar. And Stephen, can I just defer to you, what is that high bar?
All right, so I'm handing these out now just so you all have a copy, but they said, it was at the National Association of State Title I Directors, that they laid out this kind of 5-point process that you have to meet if you want to pay for meals at these kind of conferences. First of all, it has to be considered a working lunch, and then you have to meet these 5 points. Is the working lunch necessary? Is the portion of the agenda carried out during that working lunch, is it a substantive portion of the agenda?
That means no inspirational speakers, no networking. It means you're actually working through the lunch.
Is there a genuine time constraint that requires the working lunch? Could you offer them time to go out on their own and purchase their own food, or do you absolutely have to provide food because of the time constraints? If the working lunch is necessary, is the cost of the lunch reasonable? And it's the same going back to, what a prudent person had paid for that amount. Or, and then has the SEA or LEA carefully documented that a working lunch is both reasonable and necessary? Meaning, you've gone through these steps, have you documented each and every one of those steps to determine this is a working lunch, this is a substantive part of the agenda, because of genuine time constraints, we do need to provide this working lunch, and we did so at a reasonable cost. And they made very clear that these are going to be very high hurdles to try to get over. Like, the way they're moving is that they do not want federal funds spent on these kind of meal costs at these types of conferences. Now, that doesn't apply to things like ESCA Title II, or not, I'm sorry, no, ESCA Title II is who started this ball rolling. When we're talking about parental involvement under ESCA Title I, you want parents to come to conferences. A lot of times if you don't feed them, they're not going to come. That was specifically not included in this definition. This is for when we're talking about when you're bringing in people from the state, people from around the state, from your districts, bring them in for these kind of conferences. They do not want you spending federal funds on meals unless you can show and document that every one of these points was met. And it's been included now in, it's this attachment J to a lot of
The grant
brand award notifications. They've specifically included this language in there.
Are these rules silly? Yes. Are they applicable to all agencies? No. They're only applicable to the U.S. Education Department because some folks at the U.S. Education Department, they don't want any criticism from Congress that federal grant funds for education are being used to pay for food. They're afraid of the newspaper print of $12 to pay for a bagel. So again, it only applies where the non-federal entity is the host and running it. I.e., if you decided to have an association or a nonprofit conduct it, I would argue that you are no longer the host. Question?
So if you, under the same scenario, if you're the host, but you're granting to districts funds for their people to attend, and that includes per diem, is that different?
Okay, so going on, keeping in mind, it's only education, answering your question, if you would turn over to page 78661, again, all alphabetical order, to travel. And if you look at travel, it says travel costs are the expenses for transportation, lodging, subsistence, related items incurred by employees who are in travel status on official business. Such costs may be charged on an actual basis, a per diem, as you mentioned, or mileage basis, or any combination thereof. So those costs are all absolutely allowed. Those costs are absolutely allowed.
Okay.
And then, but while we're on travel, a couple of things to keep in mind that are new. If you go 2/3 of the way down there, it says for under lodging and subsistence, it says the costs have got to be written, they've got to be in accord with the written travel policy. Every school district in the state of Alaska going forward must have written travel policy. That's a mandate. And then it goes on to say, if you go to a conference, going down to the next paragraph, participation, you need written statement in the file that I authorized Steve to go to a conference in Alaska. There's something in the file that, with my signature as a supervisor, saying his participation in the conference is necessary. So auditors, monitors going forward will have to, when you go to a conference or workshop, there will have to be something in the file, a statement by a supervisor saying participation is necessary. Steve?
And to help support that certification, if you have agendas from the conferences, training materials, copies of those made and included in the file, it'll just bolster your argument that it was necessary for this particular staffer to attend such a conference.
Is approval of your travel request considered adequate?
I think if you have the agenda stapled to the approval signed by the supervisor, that would suffice. And then the next paragraph is the family-friendly policy. Temporary dependent care costs above and beyond regular dependent care costs that directly results from travel to conference is allowable. That's brand new. Last item before we let you go is personnel compensation. So if you would just turn back to compensation, and what I want to refer you to is 78647. So, for the past 40 years, the requirement for the Alaska Department of Ed and your school district was that everyone who is paid with federal funds, either in whole or part, that part of your salary comes from federal, other parts may come from general revenue. Whether you are a full-time, part-time adjunct student, if any federal grant dollars are used to pay salary, and let's agree, salaries are often the largest expense for any federal grant program. It said, if you are going to use federal grant funds to pay for salary, then you must have effort certification. And for the U.S. Education Department, regardless of agency, it said, if you are working 100% on one cost objective, not 100% on a program. Remember I said each program, depending on percentages, could have a number of cost objectives. If you work 100% on one cost objective, you are required to have a semi-annual certification. Once every 6 months, it would simply be signed by you or a supervisor with first-hand knowledge saying that for the prior 6 months, this individual worked 100% on X, Y, Z on this one activity. If you worked on 2 or more cost objectives, the law made reference to what was called PARS, acronym PARS, Personnel Activity Reports. PARS had 4 elements. 1, they had to be signed by the employee. 2, they had to be after the fact. 3, they had to account for 100% of the effort. And 4, they had to be no less frequent than monthly. Those were the 4 elements of the PARS. And then I said at the outset today, one of the underwriting reasons for throwing all these old rules out and coming up with new rules were all the multi-million-dollar audits on time and effort certification. So OMB and COFAR have said, out with the old, in with the new, and what's the new? And the new basically says, PARS are no longer required. PARS are no longer required. In fact, the new law says we're not requiring after-the-fact certification. We're not requiring that the employee sign it. We're not requiring it that it be done at least monthly. They've eliminated those 3. The only element of the PARS that is continued is the one that the effort certifications reflect 100% of what the employee worked on. So let me repeat, under PARS we have 4 elements going forward, only one of those 4 is still required. What is the new requirement? That is set forth in page 78647. Middle paragraph, middle column, middle of that column, number I. Standards for documentation of personnel expenses. Do you have that there? Again, 78647, middle column, at the middle, I. Standards for documentation of personnel expenses. It says, charges to federal awards for salaries and wages must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. These records must, and this is the new law, be supported by a system of internal controls which provides a reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. That's essentially the shift here. So the new law says you have to have a system of controls that provides a reasonable assurance that the way you're paying people is accurate. And we, as lawyers, we hate it when the statement says accurate and reasonable, because we think there's a distinction between accurate and reasonable. But it says a reasonable assurance that you're accurately tracking what your employees are doing. You don't need them to sign it. Doesn't have to be signed by the supervisor. Doesn't have to be after the fact. Doesn't have to be monthly. Just a system that provides a reasonable assurance that what you're doing accurately reflects what your folks are working on. My opinion, you're faced now with a decision going forward, as all of your school districts, beginning on July 1, 2015. To be or not to be, do we continue with the system that we've been perfecting over the last several years using PARS? Any system that you